Emily stood in the funeral home, her small hands tightly gripping the sides of her dress. The room was filled with the soft murmur of people whispering and the occasional sound of someone crying. The scent of fresh flowers mixed with the faint smell of polished wood. The air felt heavy, as if the sadness of the people inside had settled over everything like a thick blanket. At the front of the room, surrounded by candles and flowers, lay the wooden coffin. Inside it rested her father, the man who had once lifted her high onto his shoulders, who had told her bedtime stories, and who had always made her feel safe. But now he was still and silent. His eyes would never open again. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. It had been only a few days since he had left them, and she still couldn't believe he was really gone. People around her were saying things like, "Be strong," and "He's in a better place now." But Emily didn't want to hear those words. She just wanted her father back. Slowly, she took a step forward, then another. Her mother, standing nearby, reached out as if to stop her, but then hesitated. Maybe she understood that Emily needed this moment. When she reached the coffin, she hesitated for a second, staring at her father's peaceful face. He looked like he was just sleeping, but she knew the truth. Her lips trembled as she reached out a hand, gently touching his. It was cold, colder than she had expected. A sob rose in her throat, but she held it back. Tears welled up in her eyes as she leaned over him. She didn't care that people were watching. She didn't care what they thought. All she wanted was to hug her father one last time. Carefully, she rested her head against his chest and wrapped her small arms around him. For a moment, everything else disappeared. The whispers of the guests, the soft crying, even the flickering of the candles, all of it faded away. There was only her and her father. She closed her eyes, wishing she could feel the warmth of his hug one last time. Then something strange happened. At first, she thought she imagined it. A faint warmth, so small it could have been her own heartbeat against him. But no, there it was again. A small, almost unnoticeable shift beneath her cheek. Her eyes snapped open, and her breath caught in her throat. Had she just felt something? Or was it just her mind playing tricks on her? A tiny noise escaped from her father's lips. It was so soft that no one else seemed to hear it. Emily gasped, pulling back slightly, her heart racing faster than ever. She wasn't imagining it. Something was happening. Emily's eyes widened in shock. Her heart pounded so loudly in her chest that she could hear it in her ears. She stared at her father's face, unable to move, unable to speak. Had she really just heard something? Had she felt something? Or was it only her imagination? For a moment, she hesitated, afraid that she was only dreaming. But then it happened again. A faint, soft breath escaped from her father's lips. This time, she was sure it was real. She gasped loudly, stepping back, her hands shaking. "Mom," she cried out, her voice trembling. "Dad." He moved. The room, which had been filled with quiet whispers and soft sobs, suddenly fell completely silent. People turned to look at her. Some frowned, thinking the poor girl was just overwhelmed with grief. Others exchanged confused glances, unsure of what to say. Emily's mother, who had been speaking with a relative, rushed forward. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with worry. "Emily, sweetheart," she said gently, trying to pull her away. "I know this is hard, but—" "No, Mom. He's breathing. I heard him." Emily insisted, refusing to let go of the coffin. Tears streamed down her face, but this time, they were not just from sadness. They were from something else. Hope. A few guests started moving closer, curiosity and concern in their eyes. The funeral director, an elderly man with graying hair, quickly stepped forward, his face serious. "Young lady," he said in a calm voice, "sometimes our minds play tricks on us when we are sad. It's normal to feel." Before he could finish his sentence, a sudden, sharp gasp filled the room. It wasn't Emily this time. It came from the coffin. A collective gasp spread through the crowd. People stepped back, some clutching their mouths in shock. A woman let out a small scream, while others simply stood frozen in disbelief. Emily's mother's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Oh my God," she whispered. The funeral director, who had been calm just moments ago, suddenly looked nervous. He quickly leaned over the coffin, checking for any sign of movement. His hands trembled as he reached out, feeling for a pulse. For a few heart-stopping seconds, nothing happened. Then, Emily's father's fingers twitched. The entire room erupted into chaos. Some people screamed, others ran to the back of the room, while a few brave ones stepped closer, their eyes filled with shock. The funeral director stumbled backward, almost losing his balance. Emily, however, didn't move. She stood there, staring at her father's face, her small hands clenched into fists. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing for sure: her father wasn't gone. He was coming back. The room was no longer silent. People whispered in hushed voices, their faces filled with shock and disbelief. Some clutched their chests, while others shook their heads as if trying to convince themselves they hadn't just seen what they had seen. Emily, however, had no doubts. She could still feel her heart racing, her breath coming in short, quick gasps. Her father had moved. She had seen it with her own eyes. The funeral director, though shaken, quickly regained his composure and turned to one of the guests. "Someone, call a doctor," he ordered. His voice was firm, but there was no hiding the fear behind it. A man in the crowd stepped forward. "I'm a doctor," he announced, moving closer to the coffin. He adjusted his glasses and knelt beside Emily's father, his hand steady despite the tension in the air. Emily's mother pulled Emily close, holding her tightly, but Emily refused to look away. She needed to know what was happening. The doctor placed 2 fingers against Emily's father's neck, searching for a pulse. The room seemed to hold its breath. After a few moments, his eyes widened. "There's a pulse," he said, barely above a whisper. Then, louder, "He's alive." A fresh wave of gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd. Some people clapped their hands over their mouths in disbelief, while others backed away as if afraid. Emily's mother's knees nearly gave out, and she clutched the side of the coffin for support. "How?" she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "They said he was gone. They said." The doctor didn't answer right away. Instead, he pressed his ear close to Emily's father's chest, listening intently. He then placed his fingers near the man's wrist, feeling for another pulse. A moment later, he turned to the funeral director. "We need an ambulance. Now." The funeral director, who still looked pale, nodded and fumbled for his phone. Emily's father's lips parted slightly, and a weak, raspy sound escaped. It was barely a whisper, but Emily heard it. "Emily." Her eyes filled with tears. "Daddy," she choked out, gripping the edge of the coffin. His eyelids fluttered slightly. He was trying to open them. Emily's mother sobbed, covering her mouth with her hands, while the doctor gently shook his head in amazement. This is incredible," he muttered. "It's a miracle." The crowd, though still filled with shock, now watched with a mixture of awe and wonder. The man they had come to mourn, the man they had believed was gone forever, was somehow alive. Emily reached out, gently touching her father's hand. It was no longer as cold as before. The ambulance sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Emily didn't know how or why this had happened, but she didn't care. All that mattered was that her father was still with her. The sound of ambulance sirens filled the air, growing louder as they approached the funeral home. The once quiet gathering had turned into a scene of shock and confusion. Some people were still whispering in disbelief, while others simply stood frozen, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Emily never let go of her father's hand. She could feel a faint warmth now, something that had been missing before. His fingers twitched slightly, and even though his movements were weak, they were real. He was alive. Paramedics rushed inside, pushing through the stunned crowd. Their bright uniforms stood out against the dark, solemn setting of the funeral home. One of them, a tall man with a calm but serious expression, immediately took charge. "We need space," he said, waving people back. "Give us room to work." Emily's mother pulled her aside, wrapping an arm around her protectively. "Stay close to me," she whispered, though her voice was still shaking. The paramedics carefully lifted Emily's father from the coffin and placed him onto a stretcher. The doctor who had first checked his pulse spoke quickly to them, explaining what had happened. The paramedics exchanged glances, clearly as shocked as everyone else, but they focused on their job. They checked his vital signs, listening to his heartbeat, feeling for his pulse, and shining a small flashlight into his barely opened eyes. "This is unbelievable," one of them muttered. "He was declared dead, and now we need to move fast," another paramedic interrupted. "His pulse is weak, but he's definitely alive." Emily's father let out a small groan, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. It was the most beautiful sound Emily had ever heard. She wanted to run to him, to hug him again, but her mother held her back. "Daddy," Emily whispered, her voice breaking. His eyelids fluttered, as if he was trying to see her, but he was still too weak. The paramedics secured him onto the stretcher and started wheeling him toward the ambulance. Emily's mother wiped her tears quickly and turned to the funeral director. "We're going with him," she said firmly, her voice filled with determination. The man, still pale from shock, nodded quickly. "Yes, of course. Go." Emily and her mother rushed outside, following the paramedics as they loaded her father into the ambulance. The flashing red and blue lights painted the darkening sky, making the moment feel even more unreal. Before stepping into the ambulance, one of the paramedics turned to Emily's mother. "You can come with us," he said, "but only one person." Emily's mother hesitated for just a second before looking down at her daughter. She gently touched Emily's cheek. "Go, sweetheart. Be with your father." Emily's eyes widened. "Really?" Her mother nodded, her own eyes filled with emotion. "He needs you. Go." Without wasting another second, Emily climbed into the ambulance and grabbed her father's hand once more. As the doors closed behind her, and the vehicle sped toward the hospital, she refused to let go. The ride to the hospital felt like it took forever, even though Emily knew it wasn't far. The sirens wailed loudly, cutting through the night air as the ambulance sped through the city streets. The bright lights outside flashed by in a blur, but inside the vehicle, all that mattered was her father. Emily's heart raced as she sat beside his stretcher, her small hand gently holding his. His skin was still cool to the touch, but there was something different now, something that told her he was fighting to come back. His breathing was still shallow, but there was a rhythm to it, a pulse of life. The paramedics worked quickly, monitoring his vital signs, attaching wires to his chest, and checking his oxygen levels. One of them glanced at Emily, his face serious but kind. "He's hanging on," he said softly. "But we need to get him to the hospital fast. He's been through a lot." Emily nodded, though she didn't fully understand everything the paramedic was saying. All she knew was that her father was alive, and that was all that mattered. She kept her eyes on his face, willing him to open his eyes, to speak, to show her that he was truly back. As the ambulance rushed down the road, Emily's thoughts kept drifting back to the funeral home. She couldn't believe what had happened. One moment, they were saying goodbye to her father, and the next, he was breathing again, fighting against death, as if nothing had ever happened. She remembered the warmth she had felt when she hugged him, how the coldness had slowly faded from his body. It had been like a spark. Something inside him had awoken, and she had been the one to help him. The thought filled her with a mix of wonder and hope. Her father had always been strong. He had always been there to protect her, to guide her through life. But now, it felt like he was the one who needed protection. Emily didn't want to think about what could have happened if they hadn't noticed his movement, if she hadn't been there. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him again. The ambulance pulled into the hospital parking lot, and the paramedics worked quickly to unload her father. Emily stayed close, her hand still clutching his. The hospital doors swung open, and medical staff rushed to meet them, wheeling her father into the emergency room. "Is he going to be okay?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible, but the paramedic who had spoken to her before gave her a reassuring smile. "He's tough," he said. "We'll do everything we can." As they rushed her father into the ER, Emily hesitated at the doors, looking back at the hallway. She felt a knot in her stomach, but knew she couldn't leave him now. She had to stay, had to be there, because somehow, deep inside her, she knew that her father wasn't done fighting yet. A nurse appeared, gently guiding her to the waiting area. "You can't go in yet, sweetheart, but we'll keep you updated, I promise." Emily nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She sank into a chair, her legs feeling like jelly beneath her. Her fingers still tingled from holding her father's hand. She didn't know how long it had been since she had entered the ambulance, but it felt like a lifetime. All she could do now was wait and pray. The waiting room was quiet, except for the occasional shuffle of nurses' shoes or the soft click of a phone being answered. Emily sat in the corner, her hands gripping the edge of the seat, her eyes fixed on the hospital doors as though willing them to open. Time felt stretched, like the seconds themselves were dragging on, unwilling to move forward. Her mother, sitting beside her, had fallen silent too, her face pale and tired. Emily could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear she felt inside her own chest. The sudden shift from the funeral home to the hospital had left them both in a state of shock, unsure of what to believe. The thought that her father might actually survive was both a miracle and a mystery. A nurse entered the waiting room, her face kind but serious. She stopped in front of Emily and her mother, and for a moment, all three of them held their breath, waiting for news. "Is he okay?" Emily's mother asked, her voice trembling. The nurse smiled softly. "He's stable now. It's a miracle, truly. But we're not out of the woods yet. We're monitoring him closely, and he's still very weak. The next few hours are critical." Emily's heart sank, but the nurse's words were somehow comforting too. Her father was alive. He was still here with them, and for that, they had a chance. "Can we see him?" Emily asked quietly, her voice small but hopeful. The nurse hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yes, but only for a short time. He's resting, but you can come with me." Emily stood up quickly, feeling a rush of emotion. She had to see her father. She had to make sure he was really okay, that it wasn't some strange dream she would wake up from. They followed the nurse down the hallway, their footsteps echoing softly in the empty corridor. The bright hospital lights above them flickered slightly, casting long shadows on the floor. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, and she held her mother's hand tightly, as though afraid she might lose her too. They reached a small room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, Emily could see her father lying in a hospital bed. Machines beeped softly around him, tracking his heartbeat and breathing. Tubes and wires were connected to his body, but despite the sterile surroundings, Emily saw something else. Her father was breathing. His chest rose and fell in slow, steady motions. He looked so different from the man she had said goodbye to only hours ago. His face was pale, but there was a faint hint of color in his cheeks now. His eyes were closed, and his lips parted slightly as he breathed. He looked peaceful, almost like he was sleeping. Emily's mother moved forward first, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "David," she whispered softly, her voice full of wonder and relief. Emily stood frozen in the doorway for a moment, taking in the sight of her father. She couldn't help the tears that welled up in her eyes. She didn't care if anyone saw her cry. Her father was alive, and that was all that mattered. "Daddy," she whispered, taking a tentative step toward his bed. She reached out, carefully taking his hand in hers, just like she had done in the ambulance. It was warm now, and she felt the faintest squeeze in return. She smiled through her tears, feeling her heart fill with hope. Her father was fighting, just like he always had. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Emily believed everything would be okay. The room was quiet, except for the soft beeping of the machines surrounding Emily's father. He was still, but he was no longer lifeless. His chest rose and fell with each breath, and his color had improved since they first brought him into the hospital. But there was still a part of Emily that couldn't fully believe what was happening. She had never imagined that this moment, this miracle, would be hers to witness. Her mother stood close by, holding onto the edge of the bed, her face a mixture of disbelief and hope. The nurse had told them that they had to be cautious, that it would take time for her father to fully recover, but Emily wasn't thinking about that. All she could think about was how she had felt when she hugged him in the coffin, how cold and still he had been, and how now, just hours later, he was alive. "Do you think he knows we're here?" Emily asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Her mother's hand gently brushed Emily's hair back, a soft smile tugging at her lips despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "I think he can feel us. I think he knows you're here." Emily nodded, trying to push down the nervousness that kept creeping up on her. Her father's hand still felt warm in hers, and she could almost swear that he was holding onto her, just a little bit tighter. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly in the hospital room. Every minute that passed felt like a small victory. Doctors and nurses came in and out, checking on her father, adjusting the machines, making notes. The quiet hum of activity became a comforting background to the stillness that settled over them. Every so often, Emily would glance at her mother. She could see the worry in her eyes, even though she tried to hide it behind a smile. Emily understood. It had been a long day, and her mother had been through so much already. But there was a new light in her mother's eyes too. Something brighter. "How long do you think it will take?" Emily asked, suddenly curious. Her mother shrugged, trying to hide her own uncertainty. "I don't know, honey, but we have to be patient. The doctors are doing everything they can. He's strong. He'll fight." Emily didn't reply right away. She simply looked at her father, at the man who had always been there to protect her, the man who had taught her so many things, who had shown her what real strength meant. She couldn't imagine her life without him. And now that he was here, alive, she didn't know how she would ever let go again. As the hours passed, Emily never let go of his hand. She sat in the chair beside him, watching as he slept, hoping that every breath he took was a sign that he was coming back to them completely. It was hard to believe that just a short time ago, they had all been saying goodbye. A doctor entered the room late into the evening, breaking the quiet. His face was serious, but there was a trace of something else. Maybe relief, or even awe, when he looked at Emily's father. "We're seeing some positive signs," he said, glancing at the machines. "His pulse is more stable, and his breathing is stronger. It's still too early to say what the future holds, but we're hopeful." Emily smiled through her tears. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt something she hadn't felt in days. Hope. Her father wasn't done. He wasn't done fighting for his life. And as long as he was fighting, she would be right there beside him, ready to do whatever it took to bring him back to full strength. The days that followed felt like a blur. Emily and her mother stayed by her father's side, never leaving the hospital for long. They were still in a state of disbelief, but every small sign of progress brought them hope. The doctors continued to monitor her father, and slowly he began to show more signs of recovery. His breathing became steadier, and his color improved each day. But most importantly, he started to regain awareness. The first time her father opened his eyes, Emily couldn't help but gasp. She was sitting by his side, reading quietly when she saw his eyelids flutter. Her heart raced as he slowly blinked, his eyes focusing on her face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Emily held her breath, staring at him in awe. "Daddy," she whispered, barely believing the words herself. Her father's lips trembled as if trying to form words, but his voice was still weak, barely a whisper. "Emily, is it really you?" he said, his voice hoarse from the lack of use. Tears filled Emily's eyes as she nodded, unable to speak. She had dreamed of this moment every second since the day he had been taken away. And now, here he was, alive, speaking to her. Her mother, who had been standing by the door, rushed over, her hands trembling as she touched his face. "David, oh my God," she whispered, her voice full of disbelief and joy. The doctors had warned them not to expect too much too soon, but Emily couldn't help but feel a rush of happiness. Her father was waking up, and with each passing moment, he seemed to get stronger. Though he was still weak, the spark of life in his eyes made it clear that he was no longer the man who had been declared dead just days ago. Over the next few days, Emily's father regained more of his strength. He was able to sit up in bed for short periods, though he still needed rest. The doctors were amazed by his recovery, saying it was nothing short of a miracle. Emily didn't care about the details. All that mattered was that her father was alive, and he was going to be okay. As the days turned into weeks, Emily's father continued to improve. He began speaking more clearly than laughing at jokes, just like he used to. The family, though still in shock, slowly started to return to a sense of normalcy. But there was something different now. The love between them felt deeper, stronger. Every moment was cherished, every day a gift. One afternoon, when her father was well enough to leave the hospital for short visits, Emily and her mother brought him home. Their house, which had felt so empty just weeks before, was now full of life again. They sat together in the living room, smiling at each other, feeling the warmth of the home surround them. It was as if nothing had changed, but at the same time, everything had changed. Her father's recovery wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. The bond between him and Emily had always been strong, but now it felt unbreakable. He had fought for his life, and she had fought with him every step of the way. "Thank you, Emily," her father said one evening, looking at her with deep gratitude in his eyes. "You never gave up on me." Emily smiled, her eyes shining with love. "I knew you wouldn't give up on me either." And in that moment, as she held her father's hand, Emily knew that no matter what happened in the future, they would always have each other. The love they shared was stronger than anything, and no force in the world could ever take that away. Her father's return from the brink of death was more than a miracle. It was a reminder of the power of love, hope, and the strength of the human spirit. And Emily would carry that lesson with her for the rest of her life.